Okay, so I'll break it up into just two parts for us, really, and just understand that in this time, if there's any questions you might have, data you're trying to pull, challenges of data, that's probably one of the hardest things when it comes to a tool with a lot of information. Challenges of data they're trying to access, just jump in. Let me know. It's an open session, and I just want to make sure that I'm answering the things correctly. So we're doing two parts, really simple. I'm going to show you just a very simple way of how to use the tool, the basic stuff like pulling data, adding maps, things like that. And then we'll get into some of these more specific things, which is trying to pull data for your communities and even hopefully data for individuals or certain places that you're trying to work in. And then maybe that will tie back to telling a better story, which is really always about data, and visually presenting data is probably the best way to tell a story. So the main tool itself, it's really simple. It is fully interactive. The map is, pan around. You can zoom in and out. So very, very basic stuff online mapping wise. The two search bars in the very top here, one is a geography search. So it works like a Google Maps. You can type in an address. Oh, we just moved, so I have to remember my new address. Luckily, we're across the street, but you can type in an address. Once it gets that location, then you have the same abilities to really pan around the neighborhoods, get down to the street level, or zoom out to get a broader picture of the community that the address sits in. But you can also search for geographies, meaning that if you don't want to search for just work an address, you probably work in counties and cities and maybe cities or zip codes and such. So this allows you to do just that. You can type in a geography like a zip code, and instead of dropping an address, it'll drop a pin or drop the boundary for that area. So this is what we call boundaries. Instead of having to type in one boundary at a time, if you just wanted to display boundaries.
Bill?
Yeah.
Just for purposes of the demonstrations, could you use our Maricopa County location?
Yeah, definitely. I was gonna jump ourselves in there.
I think that'll help people to see.
One of the nice things.
But it's Maricopa County, yeah. Great.
One of the nice things about the search is that it is predictive text, so you don't have to be a good speller like I'm a terrible one. That'll get us to places all over. But as I mentioned, if you wanted to display just boundaries, so we consider that a bit of data, that is this first tab up here. And so this will give you a list of every type of boundaries that we use in Policy Map. Some are really neat because they're localized boundaries to the cities that we work with specifically. But generally, these are ones that you can interact with in the tool by default. So that way, if you wanted to see, let's say what zip codes look like in your given area, you have a very simple map that shows zip codes in this case. You can display these really unique boundaries. So the cool thing is this first grouping of boundaries here, all these geographies have some type of data aggregated to it. So if you ever decide to work at a congressional level and you're trying to understand your congressional members or your legislative members, you have the ability to actually aggregate data, even your data if you wanted to those members and really make a report for them specifically. It's a really neat way to join those two things together. But the first two columns are really unique in the tool because they are what we consider census related boundaries. And all that means is that every one of these boundaries is mainly have an aggregation from census data sets to it, from population to demographics to really unique things from census like health indicators to housing information and such. And the way they're paired is based on, or the way they're ordered is based on the level of geography available. So if you're familiar with block groups and tracks, understand the reason this is grayed out, it's just because it's not that it's not available, it's just by zoom level. So if you zoom in far enough, it'll show the boundaries. So it does mean that if you look at this at the national level, most of these will be grayed out just because it can't draw the boundaries. But if you're not familiar with block groups and tracks, I'll give you just a really quick explanation so you kind of understand how these boundaries all sit together. But at the very bottom of our geography levels is the block groups. And all that means is that the census that we do every 10 years, they aggregate data to these geographies, and the smallest geography that we use in the tool is what is called a block group. And really what this represents is about 1,500, maybe 2,500 people now. It's really the 2020 census changed the numbers a little bit, but all it means is it's a grouping of persons, and generally it's a small version of a neighborhood. Sometimes it's called. But from this is the building blocks of geographies. So from this, a grouping of block groups form a census tract, which are generally sometimes a neighborhood. So you can't really see it because they all sit together because block groups directly sit within a track, but you can do a little bit of customization. We'll make the lines a little larger, change the color, and now you're able to see how block groups in black boundaries sit within the purple boundaries, which are the tracks. So I show this to give you an idea of geography and scale. So that way, if you're working at data at the track level, you're probably working at a grouping of about, at the most, 5,000 people. Generally, it's about 3,500, 3,800 people is what the census says a track contains. And then below that is a block group, which is about 1,500 to 2,500. So in the middle is what the census suggests. And then from this, it goes up further and further. So all that means is that if you're wanting to look at data at all of Maricopa, then you can probably use track and zip code level data. But if you're looking at data maybe at the state level or even the national level you're trying to compare, then you probably want to look at data down to zip codes and counties and such, because it'll present that a little differently across the state and areas. This also means that these boundaries are what we call predefined geographies. So they exist within our universe, but you are probably going to work in an area that's unique for yourself. And so we call those things custom regions. And there's a little button at the very top allows you to basically make your own boundaries. And there's initially it'll pull up ones you created previously, but in there you can see there's 3 ways to make a custom region. There's the draw feature, which is just a freehand function. So this allows you to do 2 ways to draw. The draw with a pencil is kind of a click to drag, really used for more boundaries that are unique, that follow maybe like rivers and such. But click to point is just simply just clicking onto the map and dropping the vertices of a given area. You can pan around, you can zoom in to get close to the street level. And in the end, I'm going to make a really weird one. If you click onto the first point or a point, it'll close that custom region and then give you a chance to give it a name. You can control the transparency, you control the colors. Really what this allows you to do is make multiple boundaries, and each boundary is maybe a unique neighborhood that you're working in, and you can start identifying these neighborhoods by creating these custom regions. The neat thing is, once you make these custom regions, the other one is the assemble. So instead of drawing freehand, you can actually take the boundaries that are in policy map, which are tracks, or any of the geographies, zip codes, counties, then you can now make your own coverage area without having to make these individual draws. So this is a neat way to say, hey, we're working in these very specific zip codes, and this zip code is our new coverage area that we're working on. This is the community that we want to address based on zip codes instead of drawing boundaries. And the other one's a radius one, pretty self-explanatory. The thing about boundaries is they're unique in the tool because they are their own unique boundaries. They have their own bit of functionality. So if you see these little buttons in the very top here, this allows you to take these boundaries to other parts of policy map. So that way it'll aggregate data for them. So if you make this really cool boundary that you assembled zip codes by, you can say, I want to get an aggregation of a report for those boundaries. So the reports are pre-built, but each one is a unique report based on a very specific group of data. So in the case of something like a community profile, it's what we call a demographic report, really. And then what this will do is take those sets of zip codes that I assembled my own boundary by and give us a summary, an aggregation of really common demographic variables that you might be looking for initially. So things like population, what it was in 2000, 2010, and what the trend was. So this particular area by the airport actually increased almost by 12%. And then you can see there's racial characteristics, age groups, income ranges. A lot of these variables will also always reflect the county and the state that it's in, so you have a set of reference based on that. There's family types, housing stock, and even things that talk about the community part. So the first part of this report is what we call about the persons that live there, and then the second part of the report is really about the area they live in. So the vacancy, how many households are owners, job types, unemployment information, and a little bit of crime data for the area that it sits in, so not the aggregation of the area. So as long as you look at the charts, you'll see what the data is being covered, be it by the containment area, which is our drawn custom region, or just by the city or the county that it sits in. So this is a really neat report because it jumps you right into data that's being aggregated for those places. So if you're looking for quick access to just very simple demographics of unique boundaries, the community profile report is that first one. And then you can join those with, there's a housing report, there's a rental report. You can start seeing, are your individuals in areas have available housing or rental information. They'll show you things like available units, uh, amounts, so rent values and such. There's other parts of this. I won't go too far. We'll jump into that, which is downloading data and such. But the other really neat and benefit thing about making a custom region is that you can also then share these boundaries with other users. So that way, if one person is working on a set of boundaries, they can share with everyone within your group. So that way, they don't have to recreate anything, and it just populates into that boundary. So the little share button here exists in the menu, and it also exists in here. And what this will do is just give you a chance to put in an email address. And then it'll tell that person you created a boundary, and then it'll exist within their account as you as the author. Other than that, the boundaries part, it's really neat. It allows you to make your own places, but the next thing really is about adding data to the tool. And all that data is available in these tabs above the map itself. And there is a ton of data that you're going to interact with. And each one of these categories, what we tried to do is put them grouping together with very similar characteristics about that data. So demographics is really census related variables. It talks about the persons, but it doesn't just talk about a person. It breaks it out into things like racial characteristics, age groups, SSIs, foreign born, homelessness, language spoken at home. So all these are really neat characteristics that are available from the census. And I'll go into a few of these just to give you some highlights about data once we go through this a little bit. Income and spending, this talks about income, of course, so it talks about initially just general income information, but then it also goes into some really detailed information about incomes, poverty rates, low mod calculations. If you work in the federal programs, you need to, households need to be in a certain percentage of median household income versus the metro or the county that it's in, so it's called low mod. There's tax return data, it's really neat, and then there's even expenditures and accessibility, affordability calculations. And jump in if you want anything in particular. I'll get some more details as we get through as well. Housing is a neat one in general. It's just really about housing information itself. But when we do break out things like home values, rental units you saw in the rental report, but there's a breakdown for that. There's rental availability of units, there's vacancy, of course. There's really neat ways to look at cost burdens, which is persons living in areas that are close to foreclosure or likely foreclosed based on their expenditures for housing and rental. And then I'll just cover a couple more and then I'll get into some more details, but quality of life is probably one that you're going to dig into often. These are all variables that really talk about the overall quality of a neighborhood that a person might live in. So the first submenu of this is actually what we call a points data set. And I'll explain this a little bit, but points are really just icons or address type data. And then we have data that's aggregate data, which we call layer data. So we'll talk a little bit as we expand, but this, in the case of quality of life, you can see things like, are there grocery retail locations in the neighborhood that the person might be living in? Are they close to a SNAP location? Are they actually close to negative impact places like brownfields or Superfund sites? And then of course, things like disaster declarations and such. There's crime data from the FBI crime report. There's just general really neat things about quality of life, things like internet access, broadband availability. This is a really big one during COVID when everybody had to work from home and students had to learn from home, and you can start understanding neighborhoods have very limited access to quality internet for those households. Transportation is a massive breakout for us right now because we have everything from walkability scores to access to public transit to how many jobs are available within distances. So these are really things about the neighborhood itself. and you get further and further. So there's two other ones that I really want to focus in this one, which is environmental disaster risk. These are just some basic things like flood risk and such, but the social vulnerability index is an index from the CDC that talks about how vulnerable a neighborhood based on climate change initially was the study, but actually it's being used to really understand neighborhoods in general. So what they did was they did an overall score index, which is this one here. It's a combination of all the breakout variables that are available in here. But the breakout variables are really unique. So this talks about things like socioeconomics, household composition, minority status. So something like households, housing and transportation. When you add one of these layers up, the little indicator in the legend here will give you the full breakdown of what variables are being used. So in the case of housing and transportation index, this is talking about areas that have high density housing. So lots of people live in a given area, but low access to transportation or car ownership. So the likeliness of these individuals affected by climate change, or in general, things like voting, access to groceries, things like that. Those are very important because it means that they're in areas of high risk because there's a lot of people living here and they don't really have access to transportation. And so their needs to get around is very, very high. And then the other one in here is just a general one, which is food access that we like to talk about as well. So this does talk about everything from the USDA's definition of food access, which is access to a grocery store, and then they broke it out into access to a grocery store and also by low income households. The USDA, the rural side of the USDA, did a really neat study that talks about rural access as well. And then we did a study called limited supermarket access, which is a very similar idea, but the difference between our study was that we're trying to identify areas that have limited access to grocery stores with fresh food. So instead of just a grocery store, it's actually stores that might have grocery stores that actually have actual good meals to it. The problem is one of the other studies tend to include things like dollar stores and CVS's because they have food in them, but those food places don't really have quality fresh food in that. And so we were trying to make that difference in the analysis. So before I jump into any of the data sets, let me know if there's any questions about data, any data that jumps out of interest that you might want to see.
That quality of life information was really neat. And the question I had, Phil, is does this all come from the census, or do you have different sources of data you aggregate from?
Yeah, so we have about 150 sources that we pull data from. The census is a huge chunk of our data. It's about 50%, mainly because they cover, we always forget how many questions the census asks. It is a 64-page book that the census sends out when they do the American Community Survey. So the decennial census that happens every 10 years is only 10 questions, but the American Community Survey is this massive booklet. It's beautiful and I love it. I got it twice and I nerded out. But the ACS, which happens every year, has about like 3,000 questions. And so with that, it's everything from, do you have health insurance? Do you have access to a car? How much money do you pay for food and groceries? All those are really unique questions from the census that populates through all of our categories. But we have about 100 different sources, and it ranges from just demographic information to housing information to lending to crime to health and such as well. So I'll give you a list. I'll give you that link for that.
So on that question about the ACS, how do you control for the fact that they're only surveying about 30-some% of the population, and in some communities, nobody?
So the ACS is a 5-year rolling estimate, and that's the reason. And the reason for that is because, yes, it's a very small survey initially, but because it's 5 years of data, it allows them to create a more clear methodology, and then they tie it also with the decennial census. So the counts. So it matches the low counts of the decennial census, the low geography count, and then they balance it out with the overall ACS data.
So it's like an average of 5 years at a time. So you can't.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. So 2021 is data from 2016 to 2021, including the 2020 census as well. So it's a lot of points of data that allows the methodology to be pretty clear.
16 to 20 is the 2021 data.
That's correct. Yep. Okay.
My other question, is when you're going along that top menu, is that that's comparing across the entire country? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, our data, the data itself is for data for the entire. We pretty much pull data for the entire U.S. As well as Puerto Rico and territories. So the menus do not isolate to the geography, just the area that you're working in. If that's your ask, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, let me pull you into some of these variables that are probably my favorite that I tend to use, and especially in the idea of looking at your neighborhoods. Some of these indicators are really unique, so we use it ourselves in our own analysis. So if you go to demographics, of course, you're going to get some basic variables related to demographics, things like population and race and such. But in the case of race, the census likes to the census wants you to look at race at a time, one race at a time. So when they publish this, they show just Asian, just Black or African American, Native American, and white and such. And so they started creating these subcategories of multiple races, mixed races and such. But again, you don't really get a chance to see them separated. And so there was this really neat New York Times article that published a long time ago, and we found the methodology, or they published it. And so we've copied it every year. And so now you're able to make these really cool maps that shows all the races and ethnicities together. And this is a neat map to show how neighborhoods are really broken up based on those characteristics. So if you're familiar with Glendale, of course, in Phoenix, you'll see areas in orange are primarily Hispanic, the purple is white, and then the green are blacker. So this is a neat map. Some of these maps are really neat. The darker purple are kind of given in that they're mainly 90% predominantly in that particular race or ethnicity, but the lighter colors are always the unique ones because they're kind of a kind of transitional neighborhood boundaries. So in this case, it's saying this is predominantly Hispanic, but it's not the majority. So these neighborhoods are very mixed in their racial and ethnicity breakup. And then this layer combined with the Thiel index, which is an index for I believe. Oh, wait, I moved it. It's the other one. Sorry about that. So this one, which is the other calculation to this methodology for predominant race. This is basically just the probability of two individuals chosen at random would be of different races or ethnicities. And so you can start seeing how some of these maps align with the predominant race map. So the darker areas are the high probability of two different race or ethnicity persons, whereas the lighter color is the lower probability. So this is just a neat map that shows you at least racial characteristics together instead of one at a time or individual groups. And then still within this grouping, there's things like language spoken at home, which is probably one of our neat data sets. So the most common language in the US, of course, is English, and then Spanish is the second one. But if you move those two characteristics, you get this bit of a beautiful mosaic type map. But what this does is gives you an idea of the third most common languages, and you can start understanding the neighborhoods a little bit differently. So a lot of Vietnamese in Arizona and the Maricopa area in particular. Hopefully good fun houses in those areas. And then just a couple of things just related to income in general. So if you can put income on the map. So the most common income variable is all households, but there are other ways to look at income, things like family types. You can do head of households, type of incomes, and so forth. But if you put something like income on the map, you have a very simple map that shows income ranges, and then in the case the legend is trying to explain that anything in the dark purple is a higher income range. So for us, anything in the dark color is a higher value, higher percentage count or dollar, and the other side of that spectrum is the lighter colors. Adding something like a layer map to the tool, you have all the abilities to do a little bit of customization to this layer. So if I use income as an example, let's say we want to isolate just high income ranges, you can actually use the legend to say these are only the places of income above 97,000. You can continue to use the legend to do a lot of really neat customizations. You can change the year. So as I mentioned, the ACS is a 5-year rolling estimate, and the only way that the ACS allows you to compare data is against those 5 years. So that's why you can't compare 2020 ACS to 2021 ACS. It has to be the previous 5 years. And then the other really neat way to customize the data is actually the variable, which is how the data is being created and displayed. So the default variable in the case of income is just median household income, but then you can actually see the percent change calculations that we do on the back end. So you can start seeing neighborhoods that have income change, growth, or decrease depending on the ranges. So you can do this massive 20-year calculation change, or you can do a very shorter term 5-year change. So what we get here is anything in purple are areas that have increased over 43% almost, and then anything in the light purple or the yellowish color is an increase of 6.9% or a decrease. Now in this example, it's hard to see neighborhoods that might have a decrease. And so what you can do is actually continue the editing of the ranges of the legend by editing the ranges itself. So if you click onto this, you can now make your own cut points that are being shown in the map. So if we were to move this to, let's say we do -10%, and we'll zero this out. So going here, making your own cut points allows you to really change how the data is being presented. And so this is where the ability to tell your story comes into play, being able to control how the data looks in the map, the values that it looks. So this changes how you're telling the neighborhoods itself. So this pockets here are areas that have income that decrease more than 10%. These are just areas that have flat or decreased. Oh, these are more than, that's what I meant. Yeah, these are increase of at least 25%, and then of course the ones over 100%. So the ability to make your own cut points is really important because it really changes every layer of data you put on the map, because it gets you to focus your audience to the places that you want them to look at based on that data. The other thing that's really important, let me just reset these ranges, is the legend also allows you to change the values that are being presented. So you had a really good question, which is our data at the national level? Yes, all of the data that we have is available at the nation, but you can also make the data representative locally on the map itself by changing the US data to a map extent. And what this does is that instead of using the entire national range of 95% to 600% increase, it'll use just the range of the data within the map that you're looking at. So in this case, Maricopa County, so which includes, it's only -36% and the maximum of 200%. And so the values here are calculated based on the extent of the map that you're in. So this ability, again, changes how the data is being shown. It's talking about now locally what that value looks like for the area.
That's awesome. And if you want to extract this map, is there a way to download this as an image or something and put it in a report of sorts?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So on the bottom right, anything you do in PolySmap is printable, exportable this way. So you can print this out, creating a map. You can change the format types. You can edit the title and so forth. And then we are finishing this week, so you'll be able to use this function much more in depth, which this allows you to actually create a link and that you can share an interactive map to your audience. So that way, instead of just sending them a static map that kind of just captures a snapshot in time of the area, you can send them that link, and that link will take them to the map that you see here with all the customization you did, be it map extent, custom ranges, and then they can click onto the map if they wanted to and navigate around. So we're finishing that this week. So that'd be a really neat way to combine both a static map to present in presentation, but also the ability to create an interactive map for the audience to play with.
With that interactive map, would they be able to customize it themselves, or would it just be based on our customization?
It's only your customization. Yeah. If you share it with somebody that has a subscription, then technically, yes, they can go in and make their own edits and play around with it. But the goal of the share function for us was to be able to share with anyone out. So that way they don't have to have a subscription and you're able to create an interactive map for the public audience to play with.
So can you show us a quality of life map by race?
Yeah. Are you trying to combine race and a quality of life characteristics?
Can you do that?
Yes. Great question. So let's go to the other function of the maps page itself. So understand that the default interface of PolicyMap is what we call a single layer map. And the goal of single layer map is to basically show you one layer at a time. So if I go back into prominent race or ethnicity and such, if I were to change it and say, is there correlation with these areas that have prominently Hispanic, prominently Black neighborhoods? Are they in areas of, let's say, no vehicle ownerships in a given area? So unfortunately, what the single layer maps does, it'll flip to the other map. And so the goal of this really is to give you just make a series of maps if they wanted to. But if you wanted to see how these two layers or multiple layers look together, then you can change it, the interaction, to what we call the multi-layer maps. And all it does is it does one really important thing, which is it changes the interface a little bit so you know you're in this multi-layer maps function. But the other really important thing is that it's going to be one color, and that one color is up to you to determine the values that are being shown. And in the case of percentage of households with no cars, the value of this starts at 0, max that's 54%. So you can move this slider left to right, or you can type your numbers in left or right and just understand that left is greater than and right is less than. So if I were to say, show me places that have at least 10% of the households do not have cars, then only the place in purple are census tracts that have at least 10% of the households do not have cars. And so from this, I can combine multiple layers. I can say, of these places with at least 10% of the households without cars, how many of them are in areas of a high percentage of persons of color? So the second layer that appears will be at 100% also. Well, in the case of it's a methodology calculation, so there isn't a 0 to 100%. So it starts at 2.5% and maxes at 98%. But visually in the map, we're still in that first cut point of at least 10% of the households without health insurance. So from this, I can say, show me places that have at least, let's say, 50% of the persons here are persons of color. And so now in purple are only places that meet both criteria of at least 10% of the households don't have cars and at least 50% of the persons here are persons of color. And then you continue this process and say, of these places, how many of them, let's say, don't have health insurance? Is there a combination of these two things? So another unique census question that is amazing. So this also is, it's 100% is, oh, you know why? I apologize. We're at map extent. That's why the numbers are so weird. You can do the analytics at map extent as well. So in the case of persons without health insurance, it starts at 0, max at 100% as well. So from this, we can say, at least show me places that have at least 33%. So a third of the households do not have health insurance. So we only have one place that meets all three criteria in this case of at least 10% without car ownerships, at least 50% persons of color, and at least 33% of the households here do not have health insurance. So you can really play with this. Let's bring this number down, capture a few more places. So the goal of this tool initially is to give you the ability to identify places based on a very unique set of criteria, because now you're overlaying. You can actually overlay up to 5 layers of data onto the multi-layer maps, and the goal of this is sometimes called a site selection type tool, because you're trying to identify places that you're looking at, or trying to identify places that meet maybe unique changes based on criteria that you're working at. And that criteria, of course, is based on the legend here. The initial query of this is unique because it is what is called an AND function. So it's just showing places that meet all 3 criteria. But sometimes if you click around the areas here, you'll see that some places meet just 2 criteria of the 3, or no criteria of the 3. And so the neighborhood around these places might have just as much information as the places you identified. And so you can actually change the query from an AND function to an OR function up here. And this will give you a little scary map at first, but it's actually a really neat map because it gives you so much information about the surrounding neighborhoods. So now you're looking at places. So in this case, the hashes going left to going this way are places of persons of color. So in this case, majority of the neighborhoods on the southwest side of Glendale is that, and then the northeast side is the opposite side. So in this example, you can still identify places that meet all 3 criteria. But now you can start looking at the neighborhoods really close to those places and just seeing that they meet 2 criteria and why they are slightly off from that. So in this case, this place barely fell off because of our 10% of the areas. And so with this as well, you can print this out, giving you a chance to take this map and put it into an analysis. And again, this will give you all the details for your audience to read, so they can start understanding that these neighborhoods here meet just 2 criteria of persons of color and without health insurance, whereas these neighborhoods up here meet our other 2 criteria of car ownerships and persons of color in this case. So this tool is a neat one. It's a bit of a spatial analytical tool, but it's a neat tool for you to use to start identifying neighborhoods and understanding neighborhoods. And there's so much data to use to make this research.
Phil, this is Debbie. I promise I have been listening, and this is so intriguing and so valuable. Thank you so much. So what I'm thinking of, again, along the lines of just a bigger picture for YWCA, let's say we learn, what the communities that we're serving, look like based on this data. Is it reasonable that we would then be able to say to other neighborhoods that look like the ones we've been serving, to say, hey, elected official or city or county area, we've had success in places that look like this, and here's 3 more places that look like this. Hire us to make change in those areas as because of the success we've had in other areas. Does that seem like that it would hold water?
Yes, so that's actually one of the neat things about the multi-layer maps in particular, is that this analysis, while we're doing this locally in Maricopa, we can go to another neighborhood. What's another neighborhood in Arizona in general, outside of Maricopa County?
I don't even have to go outside of Maricopa County just because we're only on the west side. But let's say I want to go South Mountain. Or in
here we can go to Mesa and basically say these are 2 communities that meet the criteria that we did our analysis on our side that meets the same criteria and the same idea. The analysis that's being done is actually being done for the entire nation, but we make sure the tool itself is localized, just because there's so many details that you're pulling in. But yeah, you can go to another city across the county, across the state, and the analysis will be the same, and you can use that same information to say these are the neighborhoods we identified in our work, and these are similar neighborhoods in your places that we've identified that could benefit from the same work as well. Yes.
Yeah, and now we have a tool that can make positive impact. Yeah, no, I love this.
Yeah, and in the case of telling your story, the biggest indicator to really use on that is always going to be the percent change calculation, because while you do want to get a snapshot of of data for the area that you're working in, the percent change calculation allows you to see how that snapshot has changed across the years that are available. So you're not just looking at a point in time, but now you're looking at have the work we've done increased households have access to cars? Have we worked in households that have less poverty rates in those areas, cost burden rates, whatever factors you're using to determine your success? You would probably have some type of demographic or housing related data associated to it, and there generally should be a percent change calculation. So those are really neat ways to give you an idea of how the work is done. Has it changed the needle for those places based on those indicators?
So that's not a year-to-year calculation though, right? It would have to be 5 year to 5 year.
That's right. Yeah, for the ACS data, it is a 5-year change on that. Yep. But it does give you a closer snapshot of the current time versus the previous ACS. Yeah.
You talk about the other 50% of data that you get in. Are there databases that you get regularly?
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
Because earlier on, Phil, you mentioned that 50% of your data comes from the census. So about the other 50%.
Oh yeah.
Like,
So
yeah.
I'll send you this link. This is what we call our data dictionary page. So this is a list of every data provider that we use within the tool, and some are very specific, some are very small in their access. So in this case, something like Black Knight, which is our home sale data, we're actually changing this. So this will give you a list of every other data provider that we use within the tool. So it's a lot of census data. The census, as you can see, breaks out into very specific departments that the census publishes. There's CDC data, there's HRSA, there's CDFI data sets. So if you work with nonprofit housing developers, CDFI programs are those programs they interact with. There's Hulk boundaries and so forth. So all the data in the tool, majority of the data is updated annually, depending on the source of the data. The most current data sets we do have some that are updated quarterly. So we do have some quarterly updates from 2023. We do have monthly updates for just a handful of data sets, something like unemployment data from BLS, which we update monthly. I think 1 or 2 other data sets. The issue with data in general about current data is that most data sets take about a year or 2 to process and collect. So that's really the reason why the census has always been a 2-year behind the current year, because it takes them a year to collect the data and a year to process in that data.
I'll have to look at that.
Again, I promise I really have been listening. I'm so excited. And I know you've only got a couple minutes, so I don't want to derail it. But have we already talked about the CRA eligibility criteria that I see on the right-hand side there?
Yeah, I can show you. It's it's in the tool itself. Let's get out of here real quick, and then I'll tell you one powerful thing to use because we have so much data. There's a couple of links I'll send to you. The data dictionary page. This page here is a summary bit of the categories that you saw in the tool, and so that way, if you go down to something like federal guidelines, it'll tell you that we have all of the CDFI CRA programs that we work with. So it includes promise zones, USDA zones, eligibility for new markets, opportunity zones. So that's a good place to start. Just do a little bit of maybe overall research in the categories. You can also use the other search that I can get to, which is the data search on the left here. So the right search is going to navigate the map to the place that you're looking at, whereas the data search is where you can type in and say, we're looking for CRA eligibility. So this will pull up any keywords based on that indicator. You can also find CRA eligibility in 2 different places. The main one is under actually federal guidelines, because these will be all the federal programs that we participate in as a CDFI nonprofit. So including CDFI programs, new markets programs, all the other programs that the CDFI fund runs, including opportunity zones, the equitable recovery areas. If you're into financing now, this is COVID dollars that the CDFI, the Treasury published. So the Equity Recovery Areas program is eligibility places based on COVID dollars. It's about $18 billion.
And is that, I'm sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole. Is that
No, it's
for
okay.
programmatic expense or research?
I mean, a lot of this really, we publish this information for our financial side of the tool, but it's available for anyone to access as well. So if you are working at a state level or even at a community development or CDFI level, you can actually identify neighborhoods in those places that a CDFI might work with you to work to address. Opportunity Zones was a program to try to use dollars from businesses, gave them a 10-year tax abatement for it, but it allowed CDFIs to pull corporate dollars into financing neighborhoods and such. So all these programs have a very specific use, but it's not localized to just business and banks and such. So anybody can use it as a tool to bring in corporate workers or outside workers.
Yeah, let me be more specific again, because I know you're at the end. We've got about 3 acres here. We are not in an opportunity zone. I'm looking at how we're going to develop it and having our understanding of some of the additional dollars that might be available could be helpful. So I could see that here if I just click onto the census zone that we're in.
That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah. Once you add these layers on, wherever you navigate to, you can start seeing areas that either, in this case, this is new markets and opportunity zones, or just one or the other. But you can also definitely go through this list. There is a wide variety of programs that the CDFI program participates in. So investment areas is one of those programs. High poverty areas, there's just persistent tract properties, there's capital magnets and such. But yes, you can use that to identify your neighborhoods. And then the one thing we didn't cover, which I think this is plenty enough for you to play with the tool right now. But as you get into this, there are ways you can download data in PolicyMap. There are ways you can add data into PolicyMap. If you have a list of businesses or a list of maybe persons that you are working in your neighborhoods and you want to start joining data to those persons, there's just a powerful tool within PolicyMap that allows you to do just that. But understand anything in PolicyMap you can download data for as well. So not just the maps you can print, but you can take an entire database of tracts or zip codes in Maricopa and get all of the median household incomes for every zip code, the tracts that are eligible for new markets, or any of the variables within our database. So all that is downloadable as well. So I'll send you some of those links. It's too much to cover in one session. My goal really is to give you a good sense of how to use the basic tools. And that's a lot you can do, as you can see.
Thank you, Onyekachi, for organizing this, and thank you very much, Phil. I know, again, I was only listening from afar, but I get it. And I see lots of opportunity for using this data in our future work.
Yeah, and if you have any questions as you go through this, if you run into a question about trying to get to a certain data set so you can't identify or so, shoot us an email. We are a bunch of data nerds. We love talking about PolicyMap and data. We're happy to walk you through either very specifically or even set up a very specific session to talk you through it as well.
Excellent. And behind you, I see, is that Spider-Man cereal?
No, it's common.
It's a comic.
See it now.
Classic.
Yeah, it is a classic. And then what's the space vehicle there?
That is a gigantic Millennium Falcon Lego set.
Just trying to be. I mean, I kind of was going to guess it was Millennium Falcon, but wow.
This is working from home. I get to decorate my office into the nerd way that I want to be presented as.
Which edition is that? The comic book?
That's the 300 signed by McFarlane.
Oh, wow. Well, exciting. Now we know even more about you.
Thank you. So I'll follow up with an email. I'll have this link in the email. I'll have all the links that I mentioned about the different data sets and such. But again, just email us at any time for questions.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.